Earlier today, the Israeli military announced it has encircled and isolated Gaza City following a large-scale attack on Hamas's terrorist infrastructure, both above and below ground. As Israeli forces continue their progress against its terrorist attackers, it has resisted calls for a ceasefire or pause, which would allow Hamas to regroup and attack again. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke in Turkey this morning, repeating his warning to Iranian-backed adversaries that attacks on U.S. forces will be met with reprisals. But as President Biden's anemic record as commander-in-chief, as well as his call for a pause in uprooting the Hamas regime in Gaza, emboldened our adversaries and Israel's adversaries. Joining me now to discuss this and more is Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. He serves on 4 Senate committees, including the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He joins us now by phone. Senator Cotton, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Good evening, Tony, and thank you. It's good to be back on with you.
So you serve on the Senate Select Subcommittee on Committee on Intelligence. What's the latest you can share on the progress of Israel's forces?
Well, Tony, as you reported, the IDF has acknowledged that they have cut off Gaza City, which is the northern half of the Gaza Strip and the most densely populated, also the one that is most infested with Hamas terrorists. That's a good thing. I would expect, based on what I know about Israel's operation, that once they have isolated Gaza City, that they will slowly conduct what you might call in layman's terms search and destroy missions throughout the city to identify Hamas leaders and fighters, their infrastructure, especially their tunnel infrastructure, which they use to move and communicate and hide and ultimately attack Israel. What they need from America, more than anything, Tony, more than bullets or weapons or bombs, is time and freedom of action. They don't need Joe Biden and Tony Blinken putting immense pressure on them behind the scenes to impose something called a humanitarian pause, which is little more than a timeout for Hamas to collect itself and to get its fighters nursed and if they're wounded, or fed if they're hungry, get them water if they're thirsty. Nor do they need Joe Biden running around talking about how we give so-called humanitarian aid to Gaza, which under present conditions is little more than resupply for Hamas terrorists. Hamas, after all, is the governing authority in Gaza. When aid is provided to that country, it's not hijacked by Hamas, it's not diverted, it's not commandeered, it's accepted by Hamas. And of course, it doesn't go first to orphans and women and nursing infants. It goes to thirsty, hungry, wounded Hamas fighters. So what we need to do right now is back Israel to the hilt as they undertake what will be a very tough campaign to fully eradicate Hamas, not just as a terrorist organization, but as a governing authority and a social movement.
Senator Cotton, I've read reports where Hamas is actually sitting on a lot of fuel. They're sitting on supplies that they are not directing to the citizens of Gaza. They could really care less about the citizens. They're keeping it for themselves. And as you said, anything that would come in would be directed for their purposes, not for the well-being of the citizens.
Yeah, Tony, that's exactly right. Hamas has, by some measures, hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel that is stockpiled inside of Gaza. Israel is currently letting in water, food, and medicines. Again, I think that probably serves Hamas's interest first, not ordinary Gazans. But they're not letting in fuel, because fuel is like providing Hamas with weapons directly. They use fuel, for instance, to run the generators that operate the lights and the HVAC systems in their tunnels, which make the tunnels livable for their fighters. They use fuel for their rockets that they are still launching to this day directly into civilian populations in Israel. But Hamas is sitting on hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel. Yet I can share with your listeners that Joe Biden and Tony Blinken are intensely pressuring the government of Israel secretly to actually allow more fuel into Gaza, which is the height of folly.
So, Senator Cotton, how is Iran interpreting all of this?
Well, as you suggested, Tony, Iran is emboldened, just like they've been emboldened for 11 years under the Obama-Biden administrations. They believe that they can fund these proxy terrorist groups like Hamas or Hezbollah or Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. They can unleash them to attack America and Israel and get away with it. And what does Joe Biden do? Well, first off, he and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, were saying a couple weeks ago that if Iran attacks any American, there'll be consequences. I really didn't know what they were talking about. They were hadn't already been attacking Americans. And finally, when they screw up their courage for their big reprisal, what do? They shoot at some empty proxy warehouses in eastern Syria. Again, Tony, Iran has a proxy strategy to use these proxy terrorist groups to attack us in Israel and then deny responsibility. When all we do is attack their proxies, it doesn't scare Iran. It doesn't deter Iran. It validates Iran's proxy strategy.
Right.
After we hit those empty warehouses in Syria, they were probably high-fiving in Tehran. What they need to do is what Sean Connery's character, Jim Malone, from The Untouchable said was the Chicago way. If they send one of ours to the hospital, we send one of theirs to the morgue, preferably 10 of theirs.
They treat their proxies no differently than Hamas treats their citizens in Gaza. They're expendable. They have a purpose that they're pursuing, and it doesn't matter who is collateral damage to them. Senator, we're out of time. Always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us today.